Walk through central London today and you'll see monuments celebrating Second World War heroes. Churchill statues, RAF memorials. The narrative is straightforward and heroic. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, sacrificing everything, spending every penny to defeat fascism. By 1945, we're told Britain was nobly bankrupt, having spent its wealth to save civilization. But there's another version of this story, one absent from elite school curricula, one remembered bitterly in Bengal villages and Cairo streets. In this version, Britain didn't go broke fighting the war. Instead, they made someone else foot the bill. They charged it to a credit card, belonging to their poorest subjects, financing the war by extracting forced loans from colonies. Then when victory came, they simply refused repayment. This is the sterling balances story, Britain's greatest financial heist, extracting trillions from India and Egypt to subsidize the British economy. It shatters the good war myth and exposes the cold financial calculus that let Britain rebuild its welfare state on the backs of starving peasants. To grasp this theft, look past battlefields into bank vaults. In 1939, the British Empire was the world's largest trading bloc, bound not just by the Royal Navy, but by a currency system called the sterling area. The rules were rigid. All colonies, India, Malaya, Nigeria, had to hold national reserves in British pounds. No gold, no US dollars. They had to bank in London. The empire's financial heart was the Bank of England. When war erupted, Britain faced immediate financial crisis. Modern warfare is phenomenally expensive. Steel, oil, rubber, millions of tons of food for armies. Britain, a small island, lacked these resources. They had to purchase them. Initially, Britain used gold reserves to buy American weapons. But gold depleted rapidly. By 1941, Britain was technically insolvent, unable to pay cash for war materials. Here the looting commenced. The British government realized that while they couldn't force America to provide free supplies, they could force their colonies. The crown jewel was India, not just a soldier source, but a massive producer of textiles, steel, food, and raw materials. Britain needed these Indian goods for North African and Middle Eastern campaigns. But they couldn't pay Indian producers, so they invented a mechanism both ingenious and ruthless. When the British Army needed uniforms, rice, or steel from India, they'd order from the Indian government. The Indian government paid local producers in rupees. But Britain didn't reimburse India in rupees or gold. They simply made a bookkeeping entry at the Bank of England in London, crediting India's account with pounds sterling. On paper, this seemed fair. India sold goods, Britain paid. India accumulated massive savings in London, the famous sterling balances. By war's end, India held £1.3 billion in these accounts. In today's money, that's hundreds of billions of dollars. A fortune. Technically, it made India a creditor nation and Britain a debtor. But there was a catch that transformed trade into theft. The British government declared these sterling balances blocked. India couldn't withdraw the money, couldn't exchange pounds for dollars to buy American machinery, couldn't buy gold. The money was trapped in London, a frozen asset. Britain was taking real goods, real food, real labor from India, and paying with an IOU that couldn't be cashed. The consequences in India were catastrophic, because the Indian government had to print millions of extra rupees to pay local producers for the war effort. India's money supply exploded, but because all goods, cloth, rice, steel, were shipped out to feed the British Army, there was nothing for Indians to buy with all that new money. Too much money chasing too few goods leads to one thing: hyperinflation. Rice and wheat prices in India skyrocketed. The poor, living hand to mouth, found their daily wages couldn't buy a single meal. This wasn't accidental. It was calculated policy. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes usually remembered as a liberal economics hero, was a key architect. As a British Treasury advisor during the war, Keynes understood exactly what was happening. He knew that printing money in India to pay for war caused inflation. He privately described it as a forced transfer of value. He knew they were reducing Indian poor consumption to fund British soldier consumption. The most horrifying result was the Bengal famine of 1943. We're often told it was caused by a cyclone or Japanese capture of Burma. Those were factors, but the primary driver was inflation caused by the sterling system. The British government printed money to buy all Bengal rice to feed armies and export to the Middle East. Rice prices rose so high that Bengali peasants couldn't afford to eat. 3 million people starved to death. They didn't die because there was no food. They died because the financial system had priced them out of existence. While people died in Kolkata streets, sterling balances in London kept growing. Every sack of rice taken from a starving village added digits to India's Bank of England account. It's a grotesque image. A mountain of wealth accumulating in the Bank of England, literally built on empire subjects' starvation. British officials in Delhi and London were aware of the suffering. Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow, wrote secret letters to London warning that the financial burden on India was becoming unbearable, that they were breaking the Indian economy's back. But Winston Churchill and his cabinet ignored warnings. Their priority was defeating Hitler. If India had to be squeezed dry to pay for victory, so be it. Churchill famously dismissed the famine, saying Indians bred like rabbits. He viewed Britain's debt to India not as legitimate financial obligation, but as strange anomaly. He couldn't believe Britain, the master, should owe money to India, the servant. By 1945, war was over. Britain had won. But financial reckoning arrived. The UK owed colonies a staggering amount. Total sterling balances owed to India, Egypt, Ireland, and others amounted to over £3 billion, larger than Britain's entire GDP. A crushing burden. Newly independent nation leaders expected payment. India was on independence's verge. Indian leaders like Nehru and Gandhi viewed those balances as seed capital for their new nation. They planned to use that money to build factories, dams, schools. They believed Britain, having forced them to sacrifice so much for war, would honor its debt. They were wrong. The betrayal began almost immediately. In post-war negotiations, the British government made clear they had no intention of paying the debt's full value. They launched a campaign to discredit the debt itself. Leading British figures argued the debt was unfair to Britain. They argued that, because Britain fought the war to defend the empire, including India, colonies should have contributed to war costs freely. They called the debt monstrous and unjust. Imagine this argument's audacity. After forcing India to provide goods, causing famine and inflating their currency, the British now argued India should simply cancel the debt as a thank you for being protected. Winston Churchill was the most vocal proponent. He wanted to simply default, to tell India the debt was wiped clean. He drafted memos suggesting Britain should present a counter bill to India for defense costs. But the new Labour government led by Clement Attlee realized total default was impossible. It would destroy confidence in the British pound forever. If Britain simply refused to pay debts, no one would ever trust the City of London again. They needed a subtler way to steal the money. To default without calling it a default. They turned to the United States for help. In 1946, Britain was negotiating a massive American loan to rebuild its shattered economy. The Americans were skeptical. They looked at massive sterling balances owed to India and Egypt, and worried that if they loaned money to Britain, Britain would just use it to pay back colonies. The Americans wanted Britain to default, too. They wanted sterling balances written off so Britain could become a strong U.S. trading partner. But the Indian delegation at financial conferences fought back. They argued this money represented Indian people's blood and sweat. It wasn't paper profit. It was compensation for real goods taken. To default would be theft of unprecedented scale. The British Treasury crafted a compromise that was essentially slow-motion default. They told India the money would remain blocked. India couldn't withdraw the principal. Britain would release a tiny trickle each year, just enough for essential imports, but not enough to develop the country. They treated the money not as debt due, but as an allowance they'd grant former subjects. This was the state of play as empire dissolved. The money that could have transformed India, that could have prevented post-colonial poverty, was held hostage in London. The British government used that capital to prop up their own currency, to maintain the pound's value so British consumers could buy cheap imports. They effectively used Indian peasant savings to subsidize British workers' standard of living. The Great British Welfare State, the National Health Service, British housing rebuilding, all these noble projects were funded partly by refusing to repay war debt to colonies. It was a wealth transfer from the world's poorest people to one of Earth's richest nations. And this was only the beginning. The real damage would come in following years as Britain manipulated currency value to wipe out debt almost entirely. The war was over. Ticker tape parades had finished winding through London streets. But the financial war was just entering its most ruthless phase. The situation in 1947 was stark. India was finally free. The Union Jack came down over Delhi's Red Fort and the new tricolor flag went up. But while India won political sovereignty, its financial sovereignty was still locked in a City of London vault. The new Indian government, led by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, faced terrifying reality. Their country was broken. India-Pakistan partition had caused massive displacement and violence. Industry was backward. Agriculture was stagnant. They desperately needed capital to buy machinery, build power plants, modernize the nation.